Hello again, I'm Matthew Gore from lightandmatter.org. This week, I'm back with my quick follow-up comparison of the Tamron 35mm f1.8 Di VC USD with the slightly older Sigma 35mm f1.4 Art Series lens. In this comparison, only the Tamron lens is stabilized, and it costs just under $600, though there are currently some rebates. The Sigma lens is not stabilized, but does have a maximum aperture that is 2/3 of a stop larger, and it costs about $900. This is the second video in this pair of tests. The previous one compared the Tamron with the Canon 35mm f2.IS. Since I've already discussed each of these lenses in previous videos, you might want to check them out if you still have any questions after watching this one. Anyway, it's worth pointing out that the Tamron lens is weather sealed, while the Sigma Art lens is not. The Sigma is the larger, heavier lens. It weighs about 1.5 pounds, while the Tamron weighs just a hair over a pound, and the Tamron is about a ½ inch shorter. Just as I did in the previous comparison, I shot with these lenses around the city of Seattle and out on the Washington coast, using my typical testing procedures. I shot with my Canon 5D Mark III, using a heavy tripod with the center column down, the mirror locked up and stabilization off, and focusing with live view. I used a remote release or a timer and processed the pictures as 16-bit files in Photoshop with no lens correction or extra sharpening applied in Adobe Camera Raw. As usual, if you'd like to take a look at some of the raw files yourself, you can download them from the link in the description. So let's begin this comparison by taking a look at the sharpness and resolution of both of these lenses wide open, the Sigma at f1.4 and the Tamron at f1.8. Near the center here, the images are nearly identical. They're both nice and sharp, but have a touch of color fringing. Looking at the fine lines on this building, the Sigma might have a little higher resolution, but it's a pretty negligible difference. Moving away from the center of the frame, the Tamron gains a slight edge over the Sigma, with stronger contrast in fine details of the crane, and much easier to see are the sharper edges of the leaves and branches in the foreground. Out at the edge of the frame, the same thing is true. The Tamron is a little bit sharper when looking at the broadcast towers and the foreground trees, but it's still a pretty modest difference. Looking at the opposite side of the frame, just looking for consistency, we see the same thing again. The detail in the shingles on this house at the bottom of the frame are better on the Tamron, and this peace sign looks just a bit more hazy on the Sigma side. With both lenses at f2, there's a significant improvement in image quality on the Sigma side, particularly in the overall contrast of the image. This isn't too surprising since the Sigma is stopped down a whole stop, while the Tamron has only changed a third of a stop. The Sigma is now sharper here in the center, and moving away from the center, it's still sharper here. It's also worth pointing out that the lateral chromatic aberration is being handled better by the Sigma here, with a significant amount of magenta fringing visible on the front of this car on the Tamron side. Out at the far edge, though, the Tamron remains sharper and more contrasty. In fact, I'm tempted to say that the towers here on the Sigma side look worse than they did at 1.4, which doesn't make sense, but they certainly don't look any better to me. Stopping down to f2.8, the Tamron has nearly caught back up in the center of the frame, but not quite. If you look at the fine details on the front structure of the Space Needle, fine lines are visible on the Sigma side, but only sort of suggested on the Tamron side. And looking at these little rooftop spires, they're definitely clearer through the Sigma. Away from the center, down here, the situation is complex. The overall image contrast is still a touch better on the Sigma, but primarily looking at the chain link fence and also some of the detail on the park benches, the Tamron seems to have better micro contrast and sharpness. It's a close call though. This is a tie for all practical purposes. Out at the edge, the Sigma has improved quite a bit, and is about on par with the Tamron now. The same thing is true on the opposite side of the frame. With both lenses at f4, the differences in the center of the frame disappear, at least on my camera. I'll probably need to buy a Canon 5DS-R eventually, but more on that in a minute. Down here, again they're almost identical, although the Sigma has a touch more overall contrast. The color fringing is almost gone on the Tamron side. Out at the edge, it's close, but I think that the Tamron side is a bit sharper again. At f8, again, there's no difference in the center, and out at the right edge, things are looking pretty even. So let's take a look at another set, this time from Capitol Hill, with both lenses wide open. Right away, we see some magenta fringing on these power lines on both lenses. Both images are pretty sharp, but the Sigma probably has a slight edge because of the Tamron's stronger chromatic aberration, but in less contrasty areas, the sharpness is very similar. Moving up here, away from the center, the Tamron starts looking just a touch sharper in the crane details, but they're very close, and the magenta fringing is still a big problem for the Tamron. Further away from the center, down here, the details in the bricks of this building are sharper on the Tamron side. Even these flowers look a little fuzzy through the Sigma. Stopping both lenses down to f2, they're both really nice and sharp in the center, but the Sigma is now a little sharper. Up here, the magenta fringing is being handled a lot better by the Sigma, and it may be a touch sharper overall, but it's basically a toss-up. Down in the bottom corner, this time the Sigma is significantly sharper than the Tamron. It's visible in the hanging plant, and also in the lettering on this sign in the shadow. At f2.8, the chromatic aberration is almost entirely gone on the Sigma side, and it's much better controlled on the Tamron than previously. The Sigma is probably still minimally sharper, but they're pretty close to even. Looking down at this no parking sign, the lettering looks a little sharper with the Sigma, but it's awfully close. But down here in the corner, the Sigma is still clearly sharper, especially when reading the sign out here. At f5.6, the resolution is still pretty much identical, except where there's still just a touch of chromatic aberration on the Tamron side. Moving away from the center a bit, they're the same for all practical purposes, but the Tamron still has some fringing. Down in the corner, looking at this sign again, the Tamron has just about caught up. The Sigma is a little sharper still, but it's a minor difference. They both look good. So, to sum things up at this point, when both lenses are wide open, they're about the same in the center, but the Tamron is sharper otherwise. As we stop down, the Sigma is briefly sharper in the center and mid-frame, but by f4, they're pretty much the same again, especially if you correct the color fringing before comparing, which I haven't done in this video. But out at the edge of the frame, there was some inconsistency. In the first example, the Tamron was sharper at f2 and 2.8, and then the Sigma was in the second example. So let's quickly take a look at a third example. At f2, looking at these fine antennas on the top of this building, the Tamron is sharper, and is still capturing more detail, despite having more magenta fringing. Looking at the opposite side of the frame, the same thing is true. If you look at the black border around this white lettering, it's clearly sharper on the Tamron side. On the other hand, if we look just a little further away, down in the corner of the image, the flowers here on the Sigma side are noticeably sharper. So it looks as though the Tamron may be sharper to the edges, but has a steeper fall off in the corners. Or maybe we're seeing some field curvature in the Sigma, or just some variation in the lens alignment here, I'm not sure. For an overall conclusion then, I would just add this. Both lenses are really nice and sharp, especially if you correct the Tamron's color fringing. Up until about 2.8, the Tamron is inconsistently sharper mid-frame to the edges, with the Sigma being slightly sharper in the corners. Overall, the differences in sharpness are minor, at least on the camera I shot with. However, It has become increasingly clear to me that I need to shoot these tests with a Canon 5DSR in the future, since these levels of difference are just too difficult to distinguish at this resolution. Unfortunately, I don't own a 5DSR, and the truth is, I don't really need one. It doesn't make sense for the kind of work that I normally do. So, if you'd like to help me continue to do these kinds of videos using better gear, here's how you can do it. I've just set up a Patreon page that will allow you to pledge $1 or $2 for each video that I upload. It would be awesome if I could get enough supporters to buy one of these things, but realistically, it would be wonderful if I could just raise enough to rent the camera, which is about $200 a week. I can't make 100 videos like this each year. I'll be lucky to make 10, so you'll probably never notice the difference to your wallet, but it will make a huge difference in helping me make these videos. And you can always pause your support at any time. There's a link below. But enough of that. Let's move on to autofocus. Again, I've tested the autofocus on both of these lenses in the past, but I shot with them again and found the same thing. Both have great autofocus as long as you know what you're doing. I shot at the local skate park with the Sigma and didn't have any problem with the fast-moving subjects. I did misfocus on a couple of shots, but no more than I would with any other lens. And in last month's video, you saw these shots from the Tamron, again with no problems. The Tamron focuses fast and accurately with no hunting, even when the subject is in shadow with backlight, or when I was shooting into the setting sun. Of course, when it comes to image stabilization, there's no real comparison here. The Sigma doesn't have it, and the Tamron does. That means that if we follow the rule of thumb, shooting below a 40th of a second with the Sigma will be hard to get good sharp results, but with the Tamron, we should be able to get down to at least a 10th of a second pretty reliably. I tried shooting with the Sigma in some of the same places that I could with the Tamron, and the results were as bad as you'd expect. This was about the best I could get at a 15th of a second, using my best technique. It's definitely blurry, but almost passable. Most of them weren't this good. With the Tamron though, shots at a 30th of a second and a 15th of a second were regularly sharp, and sometimes they were sharp down to 4/10ths of a second, although not often. Of course, this would only be true if the subjects aren't moving. Stabilization doesn't affect motion blur from your subject moving. To test those effects, I put a neutral density filter on each of the lenses and tried to hand hold some shots of moving waves at the beach to see what kind of blur I could usefully capture. With the Tamron, I didn't get perfect sharpness at an 1/8 of a second, but it's close enough to be usable for the internet probably. And even at a 1/4 of a second, it wasn't that bad, though the camera shake is more noticeable if you're looking for it. With the Sigma, I just got blur across the whole frame at a 1/6 of a second, and at an 1/8 of a second, it was still really bad. But I got lucky with this one, and it's not as horrible as most of the others. And even at a 15th of a second, I couldn't keep the rocks sharp enough for a keeper. So there's nothing shocking here. The Tamron with stabilization is pretty reliable down to about a 1/10 of a second, and you may even get some usable images at a 1/5 of a second or a 1/4 or slower. With the Sigma, usable handheld shots below a 20th of a second are rare, even for a veteran photographer. Now, what about bokeh? The term bokeh refers to the lens's rendering of the out-of-focus portion of an image, and it's pretty much a matter of personal taste, so there isn't a lot that I can objectively compare here. With both lenses wide open though, you can see that the Sigma's rendering is generally smoother, and that the highlight balls produced by the lights in the background are larger on the Sigma side, as we'd expect. Looking closely at them on the Sigma side, we can see that they're pretty smooth and the edges don't have a lot of fringing or contrast. There are some striations, but they're not very strong. On the Tamron side, the edges of these areas are more contrasty with a well-defined border, and the artifacts in these areas are more obviously concentric circles, often described as onion rings. With both lenses at f1.8, the bokeh is a little more similar between the two lenses, with the bokeh balls on the Sigma side now a little rounder, but everything else remains about the same. In general, I would say that the Sigma's bokeh is significantly smoother, with no obvious onion rings, although there are some minor artifacts present. Finally, let's take a quick look at these lenses' vignetting. As you can see here, neither lens has significant vignetting until they're stopped down to f2.8, where the Tamron starts to show just a hint, but nothing significant. At f2, both have visible fall off in the corners, but surprisingly, it's a little worse on the Sigma. With both lenses wide open, the Sigma has quite a bit more vignetting, at least 2 stops darker in the corners than in the center of the frame. And it's not shown here, but with both lenses at f1.8, the vignetting is virtually identical. This is unusual. Usually you would expect the vignetting to be more similar when both lenses are at their widest settings, so the Tamron performs really well here. So to wrap all of this up, both lenses are sturdy and have great build quality, but only the Tamron is weather sealed. Both lenses have excellent sharpness and resolution, and for most apertures, they're almost identical, but where there's a difference, the Sigma is usually a bit sharper. The Tamron that I tested had consistent problems with chromatic aberration in high contrast areas, which held it back. Autofocus was great with both lenses for me. Needless to say, the Tamron has the stabilization advantage, but I give the edge to the Sigma on bokeh, though that is pretty subjective. I give the lenses a tie when it comes to vignetting, since they're virtually the same at identical apertures, but really, the Tamron handles vignetting better wide open than the Sigma does, so it deserves some recognition there. And of course, the Sigma costs $899, while the Tamron costs only $599, a $300 price difference. For my money, I'm not sure that the extra $300 would be worth the minimal difference in sharpness, especially when the Tamron has such handy image stabilization and weather sealing. Still, if sharpness is paramount to you, or if you're a big fan of bokeh, then you might want to consider the Sigma. And that's it. My next videos are going to compare the Tamron 24-70 f2.8 G2 and the Sigma 24-70 Art Series lenses. So don't forget to subscribe now to be notified. And if you'd like to help me produce those next videos, this is a good time to visit my Patreon page. My Patreon supporters will also get some say in what lenses I compare in the future, among other things. I'm new to Patreon, so it still needs a little setting up, but I'll do what I can to make it worth it to you. See you next time. Let's take a quick look at how the chromatic aberration that I've been talking about is affecting the image quality of these lenses. Here I've opened an image from each lens at f2 in Adobe Camera Raw. This top image is with the Tamron, and if I zoom in to 100%, the color fringing is pretty noticeable. Looking at this Sigma here, it's not as bad, but it is visible. So let's go back to the Tamron and try correcting it. Here in the Lens Correction tab, I will turn on Remove Chromatic Aberration, and also enable Profile Corrections, although that's not necessary. And as you can see, it helped, but it didn't really fix the problem. So I will go to the Manual tab, and bump up the magenta correction to 1. That does a better job, but it's still not quite enough, so I'll step that up to 2, and that does the trick here in the center. Now the Sigma. Straight off, it has less fringing, and when I check the Remove Chromatic Aberration box, that does most of the job. But there's still some visible on the power lines. So if I go into the Manual tab and bump up the magenta setting to 1, that does take care of it completely. Now moving up here, the Sigma still looks fine, but if we take a look at the Tamron, there's still a fair amount of magenta up along these leaves. And to completely get rid of that, we have to go back and bump up the magenta level to 3 or 4. That's an easy enough correction to make, but it also affects the colors in the fine details of the image, so it's not an ideal situation.